I'd like to introduce our next panel about enhancing cloud security. Also, if you'll note, there's some index cards on your seats, and also the ushers all have them. If you would like to pose a question to the panel, you can write that on the card, just hold it up. The usher will take it, they'll bring it up here, and they'll do their best to address your question. So again, no cards on your seat, or just find where the ushers, they all have them. So. Yeah, the moderator for this panel is Mr. Rob Potter. He's the Chief Revenue Officer at Verodin. The other speakers on the panel are Ms. Ashley Mahan, Acting Director from GSA of the FedRAMP and Secure Cloud Portfolio. Steve Grobman, Senior Vice President and Worldwide Chief Technology Officer, McAfee. And Scott Fleming, Head of Professional Services, Public Sector and Security from Google Cloud. Thank you very much, and Rob, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you so much. So first off, thank you all for being here, and thanks to the wonderful team up here. I'm glad we were able to fill out all the seats down there.
Oh, nice.
So today we want to just talk about some aspects of cloud. We've got some great experts up here to talk about that. I thought maybe a good way to kick this off was to really think about the differences and the comparisons between kind of traditional computing and cloud computing. And I thought maybe a good way to open it up is to get some viewpoints on what you're seeing out there as what organizations are doing, the new risks that are being applied, some of the compliances around that, and just some thoughts. Maybe Ashley, start off with you.
Sure, absolutely happy to. So really, cloud computing really presents that change in the way that IT services are now being delivered. And in my role at FedRAMP, we're seeing cloud, and we're seeing the government really look to cloud to innovate and to modernize their traditionally legacy IT capabilities. And so with cloud, it really presents that paradigm shift in the way that an organization, one would leverage these technologies, but not only that, a mind shift in the way that we have to think about security.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right? So there's a big shared security responsibility model with cloud, and it's something that each organization really needs to have a custom approach, whether they're going to be using an IaaS, a PaaS, a SaaS. There's different responsibilities that the end customer or the end organization has to understand and really be vigilant and deliberate in implementing those security responsibilities, but also have the confidence that in looking to these cloud providers that this is their craft, this is their trade, that there's a lot of good security that is available to them and that's being done on their behalf. So it's really that kind of that partnership, which is very different than that traditional on-prem model.
Yeah, and I mean partnership with the vendors. I mean, Steve, what are your thoughts from a McAfee's perspective? What are you seeing out there?
Cloud has really given us the opportunity to redefine how we build a security architecture, given the fact that we've been able to create the cloud computing technology in the 2000s versus taking all that technical debt of the 90s forward, has let us create new paradigms that give us inherently better security. Sure. But we also need to recognize that the scale that cloud operates means that when there are issues, the impact of those issues can be much, much bigger. It's almost like if you think about the comparison of automobiles and airplanes. Clearly, airplanes are incredibly safe, triple redundancy, lots of safety systems. So in aggregate, it's a more safe way to travel. But when there are issues, catastrophic things occur. I think thinking about cloud in very much the same way, that although we can secure our environments using a lot of new capabilities, we do have multiple tenants worth of data. We are using things such as elastic computing, which can make troubleshooting more difficult. And if you think about the underlying technologies that cloud is hosting, it's really a superset of what we've done in traditional computing. So while you can still run traditional workloads in a lift and shift sort of mindset with public cloud or other clouds, you have all the cloud native technologies that we need to think through and make sure that we're securing very much in the same way that we've thought about traditional capabilities.
Yeah, oh, that's great. Scott, what are you seeing out there from a Google perspective?
Yeah, I think one of the big things is a lot of the fundamentals, right, at a high level haven't really changed, right? I mean, confidentiality, integrity, availability, right? It's all the same. But really the details of how you implement that, how you meet those controls is really where it started to shift, right? So understanding the detailed technical level of that, I think also understanding some of the different trade-offs that you have, right, that cloud provides. So for instance, historically maybe you would have deployed an HSM, a hardware security module in your data center, versus now you can leverage the cloud provided key management systems, right? Historically, you may have dealt with virtual machines on-prem where you had a patch management structure, versus now you can think about moving to maybe a managed service. You can shift some of that responsibility for patch management to the provider, and now spend some of the time that you get back, right, to focus on other portions of maybe the data lifecycle, right, other components relative to the broader security. So really, the fundamentals haven't changed, but understanding the details of how you really implement them is really, I think, the change that cloud has provided.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Simon, before I get some input from you, first I want to welcome you to the stage.
Thank you.
We missed you a little bit on the intro
Sorry,
there.
just getting
So
mic'd up.
I believe you're managing director at Nominet, and
Correct.
here visiting us from the UK.
I'm indeed.
So you're giving us the global perspective across what's going on in the cloud.
Yes, I'm actually giving you the global perspective. Nominet have recently commissioned a research paper specifically looking at cybersecurity in the cloud, and there is definitely a huge wave of organizations and different segments and verticals in organizations that are actually moving to the cloud. And we took a research poll of about 300 companies through various verticals, including some government agencies. And out of that, we found that 88 to 90% of global enterprises are moving to the cloud at a rate of knots. That drops down quite significantly when you're talking about critical national infrastructure or more highly regulated organizations, down to about 64%, and then about sub 50% for government agencies. So obviously we work very closely with the UK government. We provide some of their services around their protected DNS security, keeping the UK namespace obviously safe and available. And we've been working very closely with them to try and understand what that dynamic is and why governments, and that's not just governments here in the US or in the UK, but why the adoption is so slow. So I think some of it comes down to, there's data privacy issues, certainly. When you're talking to enterprises, they're very keen to understand when they're pushing either their infrastructure as a service, their platform as a service, or business process as a service. Where's that data being kept? Is it being kept locally? And I think for government agencies, especially when you have embassies and you have you're out in theatre, etc., you want to make sure that that data is secure and you have some control around it. And I think that's one of the big challenges we see out there.
Yeah, I think that it's interesting you bring up the concept of the government participation. I mean, the cloud has definitely lowered the barrier of entry for many organizations to participate. Even in the startup world as much as the major enterprise world. And I think actually that's where I think the importance of having some kind of conformity or compliance there is important. Are you seeing organizations embrace that concept, with FedRAMP, or what's been your experience with that so far?
Yes, certainly. So just within the last year alone, we've had over 40 new cloud service providers achieve a FedRAMP authorization for one of their products. So we're continuing to see an uptick. But from a government standpoint, we want to make sure that when we're using these cloud technologies that they're secure, right? And for any of the folks in the room that are aware of FedRAMP in the program, there are quite a few security requirements that we have in place, right, for our vendors to meet. And so that's one of the things is that, there's a little bit of a cultural move, and as agencies are getting out of the habit of kind of having it in with their own data centers, these on-prem environments and maintaining those, getting them into the mind frame of moving things to the cloud, not having the control, like Simon mentioned, there's definitely a lot of things there that they're looking at. They're looking at contracts, they're looking at SLAs, they're looking at how the monitoring that they need to do. It's a different role, and it tends to be a little bit of a slower movement. But what I advise a lot of agencies is make the move, make it deliberate, right? Well thought out, crafted plan to move to the cloud. It's not going to be something that can be done overnight. You really need to make sure your organization is mature enabled and enabling to start using the cloud.
Yeah, it seems like also there is definitely a shared responsibility. I mean, you talk about the role of government, but I think also, as you guys have indicated, both Steve and Scott, there's a responsibility coming on from the vendor community as well. I mean, can you talk a little bit about how you're seeing that partnership and that shared responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely. If you think about what cloud really is at its core, it's about delegation. So for the core public cloud infrastructures, we're delegating to a set of providers to run the physical environment, network power, all of those things. Built on top of that, we're now having SaaS capabilities that is being delivered by a multitude of cloud vendors. But recognizing that even when you're using all of these services that others are providing, it's still ultimately the responsibility of the customer, of the agency, to look at things like data loss prevention. Is your data going where you expect it to go? Recognizing that you'll have security policies that need to span different types of cloud environments and different functions within the cloud. If we look at some of the cloud breaches that have happened recently, they're generally not one type of exploit that has ended up in a breach. It's been a cascade or sequence of events very similar to what we've seen in other cyber intrusions. So theft of credentials, misuse of those credentials, using those to get access to a system, and then exfiltrating data, and recognizing that even though you're depending on another entity, either a cloud provider or application providers, it's still ultimately putting all of those pieces together for the organization to have a strong security framework and foundation.
Yeah, well, and Scott, as you're seeing, the expansion, globally of different cloud infrastructures, and that race to scale, obviously is a challenge for many companies. What are you seeing as the new vulnerabilities around how these infrastructures are being attacked or compromised inside of those infrastructures?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when we look at many of the surveys over the last several years, it's been pretty consistent still, right? Credential theft, hijacking, phishing, right? And misconfiguration, right? Including patch management, but largely misconfiguration. And there's a couple of consistencies there. One, that's generally, whether you're talking about IaaS, SaaS, PaaS, generally a customer responsibility component, right? Partially assumed in some cases to have been the provider doing it or doing more, right? And so with that, it's really the expansion of how do we take these known kind of fundamentals, right? Your account security, identity and access management, right? Configuration control, and how do we apply those kind of fundamental principles now to cloud? Right? How can we apply good, account security, good phishing protection, right? Phishing-resistant multi-factor authentication, right, which has been around for some time now, but is still not very widely deployed. Right. So how can we apply those fundamentals, kind of get to that baseline, is really still an important part of cloud deployment as well as on-premise deployment.
Yeah, one thing I'd add to that is, one of the things that cloud has brought us is a multitude of fine-grained technologies, so we're able to do things at a much more granular level, which in many ways is tremendously empowering, but it also makes the access control and the control model much more complex. So an IT organization that is used to typically thinking about network controls or file share controls, the types of controls you'd have in a classic organization, that all of a sudden now needs to understand serverless functions, managed services, managed databases, a whole multitude of services that also innovate at a much different rate and pace than we've seen in traditional computing, is something that we just inherently need to be prepared for.
Yeah, I think one of the key things commonly that I hear out there in the market today is that complexity is constantly challenging organizations to understand how do they actually measure the effectiveness of those controls, both in that hybrid environment, on-prem and in the cloud, which I think, Simon, really rolls into how do you make sure that you've got assurances in place that are protecting the identities and some of the things that you had addressed and talked about. I mean, how are you seeing that be a challenge in terms of where you're seeing the attacks and where you're seeing the compromise of those identities internationally?
Yeah, so I don't think it changes internationally from domestically.
Yeah, I don't either.
Moving on, the threats are the threats.
Yep.
The approach that most companies and organizations take, you still need to have a layered approach. You're just adding some more complexity to your environment potentially. When you think about, half of the organizations that are going up into the cloud probably have multiple cloud providers. Some have single cloud and some have a hybrid model, but the principles are the same. And I think putting mechanisms in place, obviously, to mitigate some of that are absolutely key. The standard multi-factor authentication when you're talking about credentials and things like that. But it's also about education and educating your staff around, this isn't an internal thing necessarily. You're putting all of these applications up into the cloud, and it stimulates a different type of behavior because they are, I'm sure we'll talk about shadow IT in a minute, but the flexibility and the ability for staff to just start to use some maybe non-policy driven applications that are based up in the cloud is much broader now. Yeah. And actually you want to encourage that, but there needs to be some policy around it to ensure that they're educated in the, I suppose, the ramifications of, or the risks involved in using some of those non-policy driven cloud-based applications.
Okay, great. We're going to augment a little bit here because the audience doesn't like my questions because they're loading me up with a ton of questions. So the first one actually I think is a little bit directed towards you in that people are asking where do we see FedRAMP expanding to, and then I think it expands to the rest of the panel in a lot of companies and governments outside of the US are starting to look at this. How much of this are you seeing embraced outside of the US, and maybe some perspective from some of the global companies here as well?
Sure, so let me address that in two parts. So the first one is kind of where is FedRAMP expanding to. We're really looking to embrace automation and also a threat-based approach to authorization and continuous monitoring. So right now we're working with various government agencies and obtaining that threat intelligence information, what kind of threats are posed to our federal IT, and we're literally mapping that to the suite of controls or the security requirements that our cloud service providers meet. And from there, we'll be able to really help empower agencies to make a risk-based or have a risk-based approach to this authorization where they say, okay, well maybe these 50 security requirements, if these are implemented on day one, you're going to address about 80% of the real world threats that are out there. Yeah. And then in time start to incorporate the other ones into the boundary, but it gives the agency the ability to start using the product faster, as well as with those benefits. And not only that, we're going to take that information and also apply it to continuous monitoring. So right now, our cloud service providers, they go through annual rechecks, audits of all the requirements, many of them, and what we're going to look is also make that much more smarter.
Okay,
right?
great.
So this real world threat information will also dictate what are the things that we need to audit, right, on a annual periodic basis as well. Just in terms of the second part of that question, and then I'll turn it over to my industry colleagues here, is that we've gotten a lot of feedback from state, locals, tribal governments, as well as other sectors within the United States, right, that are outside of government that have recognized the rigor of the FedRAMP framework and the security that our cloud service providers afford for, and we're in conversation, right, to talk and to provide that understanding, but we have seen, and I've heard time and time again from my industry colleagues that they do mention that a lot of other markets out there are very interested in that FedRAMP status as well.
That's great.
So it's great that we're moving in this direction. If you think about our traditional environments, it's very much we're protecting them, but also comprehending we might have to detect threats and then have plans to get back to a known good state very quickly. In cloud, it feels like in the early days we've over-rotated on just focusing on the controls and hearing that we're going to actually expand much more into focus on detection, monitoring, ensure that if there is a threat within this environment, that we're prepared to detect it, and then work through how do we actually recover. So not making the assumption that because we have this well-set controls framework that we won't have any issues and then just have to deal with them as they come. I think that it's great that we'll be moving in that direction.
Yeah, I'm going to jump to another question here as we move down to Simon and Scott, and I'm going to blend two questions here together. Okay, so there's a lot of questions. There's about 3 of them talking specifically about how is cloud addressing, protecting the supply chain as it moves out to the cloud, and then more importantly, how are you also seeing IoT in organizations move out into that cloud, and what are some of the aspects you see there related to security?
Definitely. I think, on the supply chain, one of the things that you see is really, especially with the hyperscalers, right? Being able to manage that supply chain is critical.
Yep.
Right? But also then being able to have additional components to it, in some cases have customized components at a hardware level even, that we're able to put in, right, to manage that supply chain is certainly something that we've built out relative to that. So certainly very important there. Also just to touch back a little bit on the broader demand, I think that goes across the board, right? So from a FedRAMP perspective, it's not just for having FedRAMP or having a certain compliance standard, but then what does that bring relative to things like supply chain, right? Having that in some ways already verified or checked, right? Understanding that there's an overlay there, I think is a critical part to that.
Yeah. Simon, I don't know if you want to expand on that.
Yeah, so I think supply chain is a massive challenge, especially with some of the larger organizations probably in this room. And when you talk about third party, fourth party, you're getting into thousands of suppliers, and it's almost impossible to manage that volume and make sure that there's little risk or reduced risk or an understandable risk. In the UK, we brought in something called Cyber Essentials, which was basically designed for smaller organisations that wanted to deal with the Ministry of Defence to give them an opportunity to still bid for larger contracts. It probably it has had some success, but it's very much self-certification. It's on a trust basis, because that's really the only way we can do it today. Unless you put some technology on their environment and you're starting to really sort of understand, their own internal security posture.
Yeah.
So it is a huge challenge, and there's not an easy solution, I don't think, for that.
Simon, you made a reference before to shadow IT, and since the next question comes up, that I'll just go right back to you on that one. But there's a lot of, seems like there's a lot of people interested in the whole leveraging the cloud for shadow IT, mm-hmm. and how do you recommend people looking at that and making that move? Is it a step-by-step process? Are there certain best practices you've kind of seen?
Best practices are probably the wrong person to ask for that. You've probably got better qualified people out there in the audience. But what I do know is probably 40% of IT spend doesn't even go through the IT group.
Yeah.
It gets spent on things that they don't, on the IT team, that they don't even have visibility of.
Right.
Which I think is a huge challenge. It's about identifying that certainly for the cloud applications that you can see, understanding the risk, and the efficiencies of those applications, and making a decision whether they should be blocked or not. But then the second challenge is once you block them, you tend to find that employees will find another technology that they'll spin up, which is probably less mature, and actually probably more risky for the organisation. So it's really difficult to manage, certainly on a large scale, different departments and actually how they embrace shadow IT.
Yeah, I think shadow IT has really evolved in the way that we think about it. When cloud first came out, shadow IT was very much of a binary. Either groups were doing things sanctioned or unsanctioned, and having visibility to that was critical. The maturity has gotten to where organizations understand that there are some functions that having some level of autonomy and empowerment is a good thing. So if you have an engineering organization and it wants to take advantage of the rapid cadence of new cloud capabilities,
right.
having that team being able to use them is a good thing as long as they're operating with accounts that can be managed. If there's things such as individuals that are leaving the organization, all of the controls around those sorts of processes are comprehended. And if we recognize that there is a wide range of functions, everything from IT defining very precisely exactly how a cloud service will be used, all the way to a monitored and managed semi-autonomous environment for, let's say, a highly technical team, I think we do need to be more embraceful of that, but ensure that we can at least monitor it.
Yeah. Well, and I think to that point, it's important to recognize that a lot of times shadow IT is not because people are trying to do something malicious, right? They're trying to get their job done better or faster. And that's where cloud can really be an enabler, right? When you start to have configuration as code, even to the level potentially of compliance as code, right? Where you can deploy these managed environments in a rapid manner, right? You can really make the right choice per se, also the easy choice for those users. Right, and that's where cloud can really be an enabler relative to shadow IT.
And some of the research that we've done as a program is that we created basically a whole new baseline catered towards the use case that we prevalently saw in government for using shadow IT. It was low risk situations where the data that was going into these environments was relatively low risk, right, to the agency, and we wanted to make sure that we had a manageable framework for that type of use. A lot of these products we found were very easily available in terms of maybe $19.95 a month, right, or per year to use these products, and going through a full-fledged authorization process might have been too much, right, from a security standpoint. And so we created FedRAMP Tailor in the spirit of addressing a lot of the shadow IT that we have seen out there.
That's great. That's great. I find it interesting. All of you kind of mentioned through the talk the concept of data. I think I've seen at least 3 of these questions talk about just the challenges in the cloud of really establishing a multi-tenant environment where you can stop the bleeding of data. Obviously, there's been a couple of huge types of data breaches in cloud environments over the last several months, where really it had to do with the controls that were in place, not creating that multi-tenancy and protecting the bleeding of that data. How do you see that changing and becoming more of a focus, both from a regulatory perspective, but also from a development perspective and implementation perspective?
I think it becomes the responsibility at every level of the stack to really understand how the data is controlled. So if you're a vendor building a multi-tenant architecture, understanding what is providing that separation of data. Similarly, if you're an organization using cloud services, understanding where your data is going is critical. So Ann just talked a little bit about shadow IT, and there's a lot of these low risk capabilities. There's also a lot of very high risk. One of the things that we've seen in a lot of our customers is people using services that convert documents to PDF is like one of the most common, and the fact that it's run by some Chinese company with no name, like that would be a good example of, you definitely want to block those and then make sure that data that is low risk data can freely go to places that you're okay with.
I think one of the other things from kind of a cloud provider perspective that we can really help with is understanding the implications of the controls that you put in place, right? Or of the settings that you're changing, of the actions that you're taking, right? So helping customers understand, hey, if I do this with this data here, or I set this firewall rule, or I set this control, what are the downstream implications, right? One of the nice things that cloud does provide is that kind of hierarchical control set, right? And so it's more of a rule set evaluation for, if you do this, here are the 10 downstream implications that you may not have thought of, and that's something where we can really help bring that information to the forefront so that as you're making those decisions, you understand the implications to them.
And Simon, I would imagine you're seeing the same challenges internationally, especially with things like GDPR and stuff. I mean, that is becoming an important factor, multi-tenancy and the protection separate.
Absolutely. We've actually, Normanet have just been through that exact process to making sure, because of the nature of our government business, it's absolutely critical to make sure that we can prove that data is segmented and is safe, but it needs to be taken into the context at the start of a process, not at the end of a process. So what we're seeing in a lot of the RFPs and the ITTs that are coming out, that is something that they're stipulating and really want to understand to make sure that there is that safe segregation of data, even within their own organizations.
Awesome. Well, listen, I want to thank all of you for participating today, and thank you to the audience for the great questions, and we'll look forward to interacting with you through the rest of the day. Thanks a lot.